Today, in our second lecture, we're going to take a look at the entire church year, starting in September and moving all the way through August, and see how the books that we discussed last time are used and how they interact with each other. Here on this timeline of the church year, the top bar represents the two books of unchanging texts, the Hieromonk and the Horologion. These books are used every day of the entire year. They provide the framework into which the variable hymns and other texts are situated. The middle bar represents the three books of hymns that depend on the date of Pascha, that is, the Octoikos, the Triodian, and the Pentecostarian. In general, we can say that these three books fill the same slot, as it were, in the services. And so only one of them gets used at a time on any given day. Now, this is not quite true all the time, and we may discuss some of these exceptions later. The bottom bar represents the Menaion, that is, the daily commemorations of saints or holy events of salvation that are attached to fixed dates on the calendar. So, as we move through September, we see that at a certain point, the amount of material from the Menaion is doubled and takes over from the Octoikos. Why is this? What's going on? Well, this is what occurs on great feasts of the Lord or the Mother of God. There are two such great feasts in September. On September 8th, we celebrate the birth of the Mother of God. And on September 14th, the exaltation of the cross. However, these feasts are not just one-day events. No, they have a festal period that lasts for about a week. There is, first of all, a forefeast, a day of preparation, lasting one day. And then, for several days after the feast, there is an afterfeast. Now, ordinarily, outside these festal periods, the Menaion only provides hymns for the saint of the day. But during these festal periods, the amount of material in the Menaion doubles because it encompasses two themes. That of the feast, so here in September, Our Lady's birth or for the cross, as well as hymns for the saint of the day. So for this reason, the hymns from the Octoikos are not used. They are replaced by the hymns for the feast from the Menaion. These two September feasts are, as it were, back-to-back. The last day, or the leave-taking, of the feast of Our Lady's birthday is followed immediately by the forefeast of the exaltation of the cross. Once we pass the leave-taking of exaltation, then the Octoikos returns to our daily services. In October, there are no great feasts, and so we see that the Octoikos and the Menaion are used side by side throughout the month. Now, in fact, this is not exactly true, because many times for high-ranking saints, the Menaion will, as it were, take over, and it will bump out the Octoikos. In October, this happens, for example, on October 1st, the feast of the protecting veil of the Mother of God. Or on October 18th, the feast of the Apostle and Evangelist Luke. October 26th, the great martyr Demetrius. But in this timeline, which is meant as a general introduction, I don't show each time that this happens throughout the year. So just be aware that there are many details left out of this chart. As we move along into November, towards the end of the month, we encounter another great feast with its own afterfeast, the entrance of the Mother of God into the temple on November 21st, with its leave-taking on November 25th. So here, once again, we see the same pattern. The Menaion takes over, the Octoikos drops out. Through most of December, we see that the Octoikos and the Menaion are being used together. But this stops when we get to Christmas, the Nativity of Christ, on December 25th. Actually, the Menaion takes over completely from the Octoikos starting all the way back on December 20th, which is when the Christmas forefeast begins. Because Nativity is such an important feast, its forefeast is not just 1 day long, but 5 days long. And during that entire period, all the hymnography comes from the Menaion. Half of it is about the forthcoming feast, and the other half about the saint for each day. And then there is the feast itself on the 25th, and the after-feast period, which takes us through December 31st, the leave-taking. On January 1st, even though the Feast of the Nativity is finished, the Octoikos does not return. We celebrate instead the double feast of the circumcision of Christ, exactly 8 days after his birth, and the feast of St. Basil the Great. So the Menaion alone is used. And this continues for the next couple of weeks, because immediately we enter into the forefeast of the Theophany of Christ, starting on January 2nd, followed by the feast itself on January 6th, and that in turn followed by the after-feast. The leave-taking of Theophany is on January 14th. So all told, we're in a festal period for almost a month, from December 20th all the way through January 14th, from the beginning of the Christmas forefeast all the way through the leave-taking of Theophany. And during this time, the Menaion alone is used. The Octoikos is set aside. Well, not exactly. On Sundays, even during festal periods, the Octoikos still gets used. The Sunday theme in the Octoikos is the resurrection of Christ. Sunday is our weekly Pascha. And so these hymns are almost never omitted, but rather they're combined with the hymns for the after-feast and for the saint of the day in the Menaion. We could say then that on weekdays, it's very easy for the Menaion to take over and the Octoikos to step aside. But on Sundays, the Octoikos is far more resistant to being pushed out. So let's move on to February. At the very beginning of the month, we encounter another great feast, the meeting of the Lord in the temple on February 2nd, traditionally known in English as Candlemas because of the blessing of candles on this day. This feast occurs exactly 40 days after Christmas, and it has a 1-day forefeast on February 1st. Its afterfeast lasts usually through February 9th, although the feast can be shortened in some years depending on when Lent begins. As usual for an afterfeast, the Octoikos is not used except on Sundays. Now, as we move along in February, we approach the pre-Lenten period. It comes around this time of year, but the exact beginning of Lent, and therefore the beginning of the pre-Lenten period, changes date every year, because, of course, it depends on the date of Pascha. The book of the Triodion, the Lenten book, begins with the 4 preparatory Sundays. First of all, the Sunday of the publican and the Pharisee. For the first 3 weeks of the pre-Lenten period, the Triodion is only used on Sundays. It's not till we come to Cheese Fair Week, the last week before Lent, that the Triodion begins to include hymns for every day of the week. But Cheese Fair Week is unique in many respects, and one way that it differs from any other week of the year is that each day we use both the Octoikos and the Triodion, as well as the Menaion. When Lent proper begins on the Monday after Forgiveness Sunday, we see that the Octoikos drops out completely, and we are left with the Triodion and the Menaion. But even during Lent, we still use the Octoikos for the hymns of the resurrection each Sunday, and for a few other hymns during the week. Towards the end of March, we keep the Feast of the Annunciation, March 25th, which is exactly 9 months before Christmas. This feast doesn't always fall during Lent. On the old calendar, it can fall during Holy Week or Bright Week, or very rarely on Pascha itself. The next time that Pascha and Annunciation will be the same date is 2075, and the last time this happened was 1991. It's a very interesting liturgical occurrence. The way that the Feast of the Annunciation interacts with the Paschal cycle, that is, with the Triodian or the Pentecostarian, takes up a major portion of the Tikhon. You'll notice that even though this is a great feast, the Menaion does not completely take over from the Triodian, as it would with the Octoikos, but rather the Lenten hymnography and order of services is combined with that of the Annunciation, resulting in a very rich and somewhat unpredictable combination of themes, one which differs every year. At the end of Lent, we come to Holy Week. And for the next 2 weeks, something very unusual occurs. During Holy Week and Bright Week, the Menaion completely drops out, and all the hymnography is taken exclusively from the Triodian in Holy Week or the Pentecostarian in Bright Week. This means that during these very holy days, our attention is entirely focused on Christ and his journey to the cross and his life-giving resurrection. Holy Saturday is the last day of the Triodian. At Pascha, we switch to the Pentecostarian, which will carry us through the week after Pentecost. Bright Week and Holy Week mirror each other in that they both have unique orders of services. They surround Pascha, and they are bookended by the great feast of Palm Sunday at the start of Holy Week, and what is, in essence, the great feast of Thomas Sunday, or Antipascha, at the end of Bright Week. On the Monday after Thomas Sunday, we resume the use of the Menaion, singing once again the hymns for the saint of the day. We should note that the Pentecostarian completely displaces the Octoikos, even on Sundays. But this is because the normal hymns of the resurrection that we would take from the Octoikos on Sundays are already printed and bound within the Pentecostarian itself. On the Feast of the Ascension, and again on Pentecost, 2 great feasts, we see that the Pentecostarian takes over from the Menaion, and all the hymnography is for that particular feast. During the after-feast of Ascension and the after-feast of Pentecost, the Pentecostarian provides hymnography for the feast, and the Menaion, as usual, provides the hymns for the saint of the day. The leave-taking of Ascension is the Friday before Pentecost, and the leave-taking of Pentecost is the following Saturday. The week following Pentecost is the Sunday of All Saints, and that is the last day that we use the Pentecostarian for the year. So the next day, we resume the use of the Octoikos, beginning with tone 8, as I mentioned last time. In June, there are 2 very important feasts, almost as important as great feasts. First, on June 24th, the birth of the forerunner, John the Baptist. And then on June 29th is the feast of the leaders of the apostles, Peter and Paul. We prepare for this second feast by keeping the Apostles' Fast, which begins the same day that we resume using the Octoikos, the Monday after All Saints. As with all high-ranking feasts in the Menaion takes over from the Octoikos on these 2 days. Now, the month of July, rather like October, is relatively uneventful. The Octoikos and the Menaion are used in conjunction with each other almost every day. There are some exceptions for high-ranking feasts, for example, St. John of San Francisco on July 2nd, or the glorious prophet Elijah on July 20th. On days like these, the Octoikos gets bumped and the Menaion takes over completely, except if it's a Sunday. When we arrive at August, we encounter the last 2 great feasts of the church year, the Transfiguration of Christ and the Dormition of the Mother of God. Just like the 2 feasts in September, they each have a forefeast of 1 day and an afterfeast of about a week, and they are another set of back-to-back feasts, like the Nativity of the Mother of God and the Exaltation of the Cross. and the Octoikos is not used during this period. At the end of August, there is one more Menaian feast, the beheading of the forerunner, which is also a strict fast day, for which the Menaian completely takes over. So, this timeline gives a rough and general overview of how the liturgical books are used throughout the year. As I said, there's always some variation from year to year, depending on the date of Pascha, and how that makes the Triodian, the Pentecostarian, and the Octoikos interact with the different dates on the fixed calendar from the Menaian. And this is why every year is different, and we can't, therefore, just pull all the hymns into one book. For example, if the feast of St. George the Great Martyr, which is April 23rd, falls on Bright Tuesday in one year, well, it may fall on the Wednesday in Thomas Week the next year. And so the combination of these commemorations is always changing in a way that makes our services more complex, certainly, but also much more rich, as the different themes interact with each other in different ways each year, rather like a kaleidoscope. In our next lesson, we'll take a close look at one particular service from the daily cycle, Saturday evening Great Vespers, and we'll describe how the hymnography from the different liturgical books is used in one specific part of that service.